Guys, if you're watching us Facebook, YouTube, or right here on Zoom, welcome to today's shiur. Today, I told you we're going to talk about marriage. Now, the truth is, I know that most of our crowd here, marriage is something that was done long ago. We don't have the young folks. Well, we're all young at heart, right? But I still want to talk about marriage because there's a lot about marriage. Firstly, even in our advanced years, how to keep that spark going. Also, because I'm still a youngster, so I'm talking to myself here in this shiur. Besides for that, marriage is not only marriage between husband and wife. Marriage is lessons on relationships that we could glean from marriage. But I have to be straight up. I intend today to talk about how marriage works from a Jewish perspective, from a Torah perspective, what it means, what marriage means. That is the theme of today's shiur, and that's what we're going to be talking about. Is marriage from the Torah's perspective, learning the laws of marriage. And in fact, in today's Torah reading, we learn about who you can marry and certain people who you cannot marry according to Jewish law. And tomorrow, we'll undo it all. We'll talk about the laws of divorce, which is tomorrow's Torah portion. So that's just the plan as it is at this stage. When we think about marriage, about what it takes for two people to get together, people from different backgrounds, people from different men and women to begin with already different, and people maybe different social standings and different financial positions. There's lots of differences already out there, and we're trying to put two people together. And I'd love to hear from you guys. I hear from some of the senior citizens who used to come to our programs, who are in touch with me and sharing with me all their jokes about marriage in old age. One couple was telling me they were celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary, or maybe it was 60th, and they said, he toasts L'chaim to my darling sweetheart wife. What's your name again? Oh yeah, and he says, putting up with me and me putting up with her all these years. He says, during these years, I would say, ich bin gewen a bissel blind and a bissel toib. I was a little deaf and a little blind. And she says, shush, you smart aleck. She was completely blind and completely deaf. That's how she survived the marriage. But in reality, let's just talk about, I know these jokes go flat when we're not all together, and maybe I shouldn't go into the comedy business. All right, fine, I'll go into a different business instead. Okay? Let's talk about a situation that's come our way. Okay? I'll have to rename people just so we don't divulge anyone's information. So, Charlie, born in the northern suburbs to his parents, Mark's a cardiologist, and Laura is a licensed social worker here in Johannesburg. Now, Mark and Laura, they earn a decent living. Now, Charlie's place, he's in, he's not in Wits, he's gone off to Oxford or Cambridge. Okay, he's got an IQ of 120. He's doing really well. And his parents, they're very generous, they're very kind, they're philanthropic, they're benevolent, they give a lot of charity. And he's doing well, Charlie. Okay? He gets high grades, he's very involved, he's top of his university class. One day, Charlie's parents inform him that after 20 years together, 20 years of married, Charlie tells me his parents informed him that they're divorcing. I've seen this situation more than once. I've seen it. It's a reality out there in life, and it happens, but you would think at such an advanced stage, 20 years into marriage. You see, Mark got an offer from a very prestigious research institute abroad. And Laura, she doesn't want to leave behind her work in crisis intervention. Besides the point, 20 years, it's a long run. And you know how it goes. They all have their little issues with each other after all these years. So they want to explore their options. And here's their son coming to me. Charlie's devastated because his home fell apart. His world crumbled. He's here during COVID because university life wasn't working out or whatever it is. There's lockdown, so he was here. And while he's home, let me tell you, there's a lawyer who I'm friends with who tells me that the divorce rate has skyrocketed during COVID. It's incredible how many people, I guess they couldn't get along with each other or whatever it was. And the divorce rate has skyrocketed during COVID. The thing is, everybody says to Charlie, don't worry. It's in everybody's best interest. Your mom and dad could pursue their dreams. Why should they live together if they're not happy with each other? Maybe they do still love each other, and that's why they're separating because they care. It's in their best interest. There's so many different excuses and things that people are telling Charlie. You're not going to be happy if your parents are going to stay together because they can't continue. So this is the story that I watered down of the reality out there that we keep hearing of situations where couples, perhaps married for many years, are, parting ways. And if I think about Charlie, even though he was quite hurt and devastated by his parents' decision, what could he do? He's got to continue studying, and he's doing well. And in fact, he's studying neurology and plans to take it even further to become a surgeon. Okay, so he's doing his part while his parents are going through this situation and trying to make like everything's all right. Except for what he tells me, it's not going so well. Okay? Something inside him, as he puts it, is just not feeling right. There's just something that's not feeling good. And even though everybody keeps telling him it's in your best interest, it's okay, everyone still loves each other, and nobody's at fault here, there's still something. He just feels that his parents, I don't know, I can't articulate his feelings that he expresses, but he thinks they could get along. He thinks that if they just had a little bit more commitment and sacrifice for each other, that they could work it out. And he's really bothered by this. So, like I said, I don't want to get stuck here. There's many such situations. In our parsha this week, the Torah touches on marriage quite a bit, and who one's allowed to marry, etc. And it also talks about if a marriage doesn't work out. I don't know why I told you this story today, because the truth is, tomorrow I said we'll talk more about the divorce situation. But I don't have data with me exactly the divorce rate, but I know from what I hear, it's high. And that's what this local lawyer was telling me as I was discussing these situations with her. And because our parsha talks about both marriage and divorce, I thought it would be appropriate for us to address this topic. And even though I know that it's not necessarily something we're all, that you necessarily think you're coming to this shir about, but I do think there are life lessons we could all take from marriage and from divorce. So I want to ask you, what's the most prominent photo hanging in every home? Right, if you had the choice to retain the memory of only one day of your life, which day would it be? Right, if you were given an example of an event that epitomizes happiness, what event would you choose? I'll tell you, a friend of mine was celebrating his 20th wedding anniversary yesterday. I know him from my days in yeshiva. Batya and I are hitting 14 years now. 14 or 15, I'm already losing count. Now, it's already 16 years since we met, but we're only reaching our 14th or 15th wedding anniversaries coming up soon. You see, I lose track of my old age. Whatever the case is, I have friends and classmates who are beyond 20 years already, believe it or not. in the Hasidic community. I think my first classmate got married when we were 17 or 18. Okay, that one didn't work out, but they started moving from there. I think about kids, classmates of mine who have kids in their 20s already, and we're just making our first kids bar mitzvah. So just it's if different stages. We're all in the same age. It's quite humorous. Anyways, the point I'm making is that for a lot of people, it's the wedding day. And yesterday, this friend of mine who was celebrating the 20th wedding anniversary, he said that 20 years ago today was not the happiest day of my life. Today is the happiest day of my life. I like that line because I was thinking that's certainly powerful because, yes, your wedding day is a very happy day, but it shouldn't be going downhill from there. Right? That's for people who fall in love. But we hope that couples will grow in love, will climb in their love. Remember, this little sign in my office says success is a journey, not a destination. So 20 years ago, you just met, you got married, even if you were dating for a few years before. Hopefully the marriage, the relationship develops and grows. But what I'm seeing from my friend Charlie and sadly many others, believe it or not, I had somebody sitting with me just yesterday talking about their marriage falling apart. And sadly, there are many. So why is that? Why do people keep making excuses? And many people don't want to get married, especially guys like Charlie, who says if it's doomed to failure. Looking at his parents' situation after 20 years. So how will he know he ever found that right one? I said when you're standing under the chuppah, hopefully it means you're bashert. It's the right one. But people are scared of it. People are afraid of marriage just seeing this situation. So if every day of marriage would be full of roses and gowns and smiling faces, then I don't think people would be so scared of it. But the reality is, wedding happens only once. The marriage is every day. That's why when I say l'chaim to a young couple, I say, wishing you an everlasting honeymoon. Because I'm finding when the honeymoon's over, and all of a sudden the rat race of life and the scramble to pay the bills and all the other hecticness that we deal with every day kicks in. Oh, and when kids come around and start spilling things all over the house and making a mess every day, oy vey, right? And all of a sudden you start seeing the good life your single friends are having. People say, why bother? Is it really worth the price of marriage for that short stint of love? But of course, I'm talking here to a crowd of people who, please God, if you're married, then you're nurturing that relationship into old age, please God. And there for each other through thick and thin, not just when it's easy. So let's look at the Torah's perspective of marriage and try to apply that to our relationships. And if it's not for ourselves, if we can inspire our children, our grandchildren, and friends and relatives and people we know, what the purpose of marriage is. Psychologists have long struggled with this issue. Right? Even the most exciting activity, if you repeat it enough times, it becomes boring. Ice cream is tasty and wonderful, but if you've eaten a few tubs of it, it ain't as good as the first one. And the thing is that, unfortunately, sometimes with life, people see it. I got it. And the truth is, Apple makes their products this way. My phone, it's not so old. I got this phone in 2016 or 2017, and it's giving me trouble. So as soon as I can afford it, I'm going to try to get that upgrade so I don't have a trouble-making phone. And perhaps people are thinking of their spouses like an Apple product. Well, if the phone gives trouble, you go get a new one. If my spouse is giving me trouble, I'm not feeling so good, it's disposable. Let's just get a new one. And unfortunately, I work a lot more. Not unfortunately, fortunately, I work with senior citizens. That's my work. But the elderly are not immune from this. I've seen elderly couples divorcing, not just Charlie's parents, who I wouldn't put them as senior citizens. They're in their 50s, but there's a couple I know, and he's 75. They're married with children, grandchildren, maybe even great-grandchildren already. And yeah, great-grandchildren already. And they separated. He jokes to me, he says he was waiting for the kids to be out of the house before, but it happens. And maybe we could think, certainly people shouldn't be living in suffering and pain. But I'm getting off topic again. Tomorrow's divorce. Let's talk about marriage. I'm sorry, guys. Okay. So how do we promote, what can we look at? What's the Torah's perspective on marriage that we can ensure that if people understand the Torah's perspective, then maybe marriages will be a little bit more successful? So that's my first question for today. What is the Torah's perspective of marriages? And if we could look at the origin, go all the way back to where marriages from a Torah perspective, I think we could get a nice, good perspective. Because in the Torah's view, marriage is not something that just happens once. Success is a journey, right? Marriage happens every day. Let me go back to our relationship with God. That's also a marriage, right? So let's think, every time we say the bracha for Torah, and we're studying Torah together, so you should have said the bracha this morning. What do we say? Do we say, bless you Hashem who gave us the Torah long ago? No. We say, Baruch atah Hashem, no sena Torah. We bless God for giving us the Torah. Okay? So it's a continuous marriage. So marriage is something that happens every day. Getting married doesn't consist of a one-time, exciting, extravagant event, and you have nice family photos and everybody smiles. The photographer joked with me, at our wedding we didn't even get pictures of ourselves. We have no pictures of ourselves at our wedding. It's quite funny. I don't know how that happened. Our photographer is not in the photography business anymore. I guess maybe that's why. But he had beautiful pictures. We posed. We saw the pictures. We're like in the corner. You can't tell that it's us. It could have been any bride and groom. And he got beautiful pictures of the room and the glass. And you don't see that it's us. Quite funny. My wife and I joke about that often. At least we have each other because we don't have pictures from our wedding day. We have lots of beautiful pictures of others. We got pictures of everybody but us. So if you're in that business, don't forget the bride and groom too. Anyways, what was the joke? I heard at a wedding, the photographer says, in the olden days, you get these pictures black and white and people are starving, they're hungry, they're living through a depression. And yet those marriages lasted 70, 80, 90 years. They lived, they stayed together forever. And he says, today, everybody's smiling. If you don't smile, the photographer will shoot you. And yet the marriages don't seem to last. It can't be a one-time affair. It's not something that, once you get the bills and the grind of life, all of a sudden we're talking about divorce. The magic of the wedding day, the excitement that makes buying furniture together like a trip to Disney, going out to buy furniture, or a morning coffee together, like it's as exciting as like a trip to Paris. That's something you have to keep going. That's why I tell people it should be an eternal honeymoon. Don't get divorced right after the honeymoon. Just stay on honeymoon forever. And with that in mind, if the magic is there, it is there. We have to find it. Obviously, I'm not talking about situations where there's abuse and there's hurt. And in that case, divorce is a mitzvah. And we'll talk about that tomorrow. Be back for that. But since we're talking about the Torah's view, the Torah's perspective of marriage, let's explore a little bit the history. What are the origins of marriage? Let's look at it from the Torah, okay? Let's see it from the Torah's perspective. Anyone who's familiar with halacha, you know that any form of sexual activity between a Jewish man and a woman is forbidden unless they are married to each other. There's no leeway in halacha for any casual relations. Doesn't exist in Jewish law. No test drive, sorry. The Torah expects a man and a woman to take the relationship seriously or don't be involved. That's Jewish law. And although you could say the strict halachic restrictions on sexual relations, what we know, what we're familiar with, obviously we got the Torah at Mount Sinai, and the halacha was taught to us as we continue, as we've been discussing, as our sages taught it to us. And that's thousands of years after creation. But the concept of marriage in Torah, and I'm studying Tractate Kedushin with the laws of marriage. I started studying it on a Tuesday. I have a chavrusa I study it with at shul before we daven Mincha Ma'ariv in the evenings. We've been studying it for a couple of years. Let me tell you, it's complex laws, studying the Talmud. But we started studying it before he got married, and we're still studying it. And he got married. I officiated his marriage in 2014. 2014, we still study it together. Some weeks we get slack, but what's the very first marriage that the Talmud tells us that's recorded in the Torah that we know? Well, obviously Adam and Eve. Okay, it says it right there at the very beginning. Okay, the very first story of creation, and it says that Adam Yoda es Chava. The Torah uses a euphemism of intimacy that Adam got to know Eve. So knowledge in a biblical sense is intimacy. And it's not some legalistic concept. There's the Torah tells us, even before we received the Torah at Mount Sinai, obviously there was a commitment, and we see the couples in history, Adam and Eve. We know our patriarchs and matriarchs. We know the relationships. Okay, but there is, if you look at the Torah's description of marriage, we don't really see a elaborate description of the Torah on marriage. Okay, go through the verses, and you're not going to find specific instruction. In fact, it's very scarce. It's very limited. Go through the Torah. I can't recall seeing specific laws. In fact, we know more about marriage from the laws of divorce in our parsha. But we see in the Torah about Adam and Eve, what does the Torah describe? That Adam and Eve, they started out as a single unit. There's a good old joke. No, don't take it as a chauvinistic. In fact, the man who told it is no longer alive, but I walked into a pizza shop one day. There was an old man there, his name was Eddie. And Eddie owned this pizza company. They did flying pizzas all over the world. I was chatting with him. He knew my father from long ago. I think they were in the Exodus ship together. There were kids together on the Exodus ship coming to Israel. So I was a bacher. I wasn't getting married. I asked Eddie. He said, "Oh, you're dating? Do you have anyone?" I said, "Let me give you a marriage tip." It sounded a little bit chauvinistic, but the truth is, I think it's a good vart. So he says to me, Adam was a bachelor. He's getting lonely. First day in this world, it's just him. He's alone. He asked God, what will it cost to have some company? God said it will cost an arm and a leg. He says, now, what could you give me for a rib? Now, of course, it's a silly joke. But then he said to me, in all seriousness, he said, what you invest in your relationship is what you will get out of the relationship. My father told me on the wedding day, he said, for how long are you going to be, it says, Chassan Daim El Melech, for how long is the groom compared to a king? My father said to me, as long as you treat your bride as the queen, you'll be a king. That's the way it goes. I asked him how long he dated my mother for. He said for almost 40 years. And if we look at the original marriage, how I digressed to that little sidetracking joke, the Torah describes how God created Adam out of Chava out of Adam's flesh. Adam and Eve, they started out that one single unit until God removed a piece of Adam's flesh and formed Eve from it. So let me ask you, what's more natural? That Adam and Eve remain separate or that they unite? That two separate entities, which were once one single entity, right? That they should reunite into one, or should they forever remain separate? What do you think? in the States, in Sweden, in Israel, many places they have IKEA furniture. When Batya and I got married, we wanted to build bookcases. In fact, most of my books are still sitting back at home in New York. Slowly, each time we travel, bring a few boxes back with us. So back then, we bought IKEA furniture, which is like, you buy these boxes, very nicely, neatly packed, and then you have to assemble the various nuts and bolts and all the different pieces of wood until you have the beautiful, nice bookshelf. Batya was much better than at the building than I was. So perhaps you could see marrying is like screwing the bottle cap onto the bottle. Yeah, you do this, or you're putting the pieces of the puzzle together. That's from the Torah. The Torah is telling us that man should leave their parents' home, and should reattach to their spouse. Torah says you become one flesh. Okay, so we see marriage from the very beginning, even before God gives us the Torah. Now, of course, once we got the Torah, within Torah we have laws of marriage. Okay, and within Torah, it is forbidden to have sexual relations between a man and a woman if they're not your spouse. So, before Torah, marriage existed, no doubt. And that's where we come from. But God didn't just say, if you want to engage in sex, get married. That wasn't the case. Rather, there's a marriage process. What we know today, obviously, as chuppah, kiddushin, the process of marriage, you have to follow the exact rules in order for the marriage to be legitimate, in order for it to be qualified. Now, in my capacity as a rabbi, I had to study to be a marriage officer in order to civilly affect marriages. But also religiously, there are rules and regulations, and there's tractates of the Talmud that discuss this. There's a whole tractate called Kesubos, which is about the ketubah. There's a tractate called Kedushin. And yes, there are tractates about divorce as well, Gittin. But I wanted to share with you, the Torah does not explicitly mention the wedding ceremony. We don't see the term chuppah in the Torah, or the yichud room, or any of the other aspects and facets of a marriage that you're familiar with. The biblical source for a chuppah, for the ceremony that we know today, is actually from, you could say it's connected to our parsha, where it says, Ki yikach ish isha. If a man takes a wife. Okay? What is this concept of taking? What do you mean you take a wife? Okay? This is the formal act. Now, you could say it's proposal, or, this is where placing a ring on the finger of your... Now, from a halachic perspective, the ring is placed by the man on the woman's finger, not the other way around. Today, of course, we need equality and all the other facets and aspects. I mean, the truth is, my mother liked the idea of a man wearing a ring just because it's good to know if a man is married. Let it be public knowledge. There's nothing wrong halachically with a man wearing a ring. Okay, in history, I don't know why in our community maybe it's not common practice, but certainly under the chuppah, it's only the man who puts the ring on the groom, on the bride. But let's look at the words in this week's parsha, where it says ki yikach ish isha. The term taking a wife, actually, it's in many places in the Torah. Our parsha, but numerous other places. And in our parsha, it's really in the context of divorce, so I'll talk about that more tomorrow. But that's the terminology that Torah uses for marriage. So obviously, in today's, you have the ring, right? Now, the truth is, that a wedding ring is only one of three options that halacha provides us for the groom to propose, to formalize the marriage. Not to propose, to formalize the marriage. What are they? So the Talmud tells us they are kesef, shtar, and bia. Kesef is giving money to your bride. Commonly it's a ring, but it doesn't have to be. Give anything of value. Second is shtar. That's why we have a tractate called kesubas. That is writing a contract. The kesuba. And the third is bia. Bia is being sexually intimate. That is the third expression of intent for a lasting marriage. Okay, so I want to just look a little bit, just explore some of what the Talmud tells us about marriage and where we learn it from, what are its origins, what it is that consecrates a marriage. And I think you'll find it interesting. And of course, we'll have to conclude with some lessons for life. Says the Gemara, before the Torah was given, when a man would meet a woman, they would meet in the marketplace, wherever they met, and they decided they like each other, they want to get married. So the Gemara says he would bring her home, they would have relations in private, and he would make her his wife. That was the old archaic way. But the Gemara tells us, once the Torah was given, we were commanded that when a man desires to marry a woman, he has to acquire her. Now, acquiring, I know, acquire sounds like you're buying something. I'm sure there must be a better. Every transaction in Jewish law, in order for it to be legally binding, it's something that's called a kinyan. And you need to have a kinyan. You need to have this transaction in order for it to take effect. Every agreement needs a transaction. Without that transaction, there's no relationship. It doesn't work. So that's the term ki yikach. Acquire means there's a transaction involved. It shows commitment. Like in business, you put down a deposit, the same thing. And this has to be done in front of witnesses. That's why you'll notice that every marriage, we discussed last week about marriages and witnesses, we say that in front of these two designated witnesses to the exclusion of all others, because they have to be specific witnesses. We have to know who the witnesses are. They sign on the ketubah and they watch. So, and there are different sets of witnesses that you could honor, but the point is, only after this are they married. So, of course, there are the other two methods. And the truth is, today, we do all three. It's not just one. Today, the process of marriage is formalized with all three of these. First, under the chuppah, there's giving the ring. And then there is the kesuba, which is the contract. And you go home together. The truth is, you don't even have to just go home together. That's the yichud room. When a couple seclude together in a yichud room, what's the purpose of it? Technically speaking, I don't know any, I never engaged couples what they do in there, but the purpose is you have to be there minimum of 8 minutes to fulfill the act, but that's not realistic necessarily. So it is, you go home together later. Now, according to the Torah, the chassan, the groom, has to do the simple act to formalize his marriage. Give the bride a ring, or be intimate, or give her the ketubah, the contract. It's actually a prenup contract. It's just for the wife's benefit, because if you look at a ketubah, it's all about how a husband's going to look after his wife, really. It's certainly a good idea today to have antenuptial contracts and all the other things in place because of the current statistics of marriages. But of course, if you've been to a chuppah, you know that a halachic wedding ceremony is a lot more elaborate than just giving a ring. The bride and groom are enveloped by the chuppah canopy. And after the chuppah, they go into the yichud. And you have witnesses, and there's a whole celebration. So it's not just romance and sunset background. We don't squeeze the yichud room into the schedule just so bride and groom could have some time with each other away from the cameras or the guest. This is all part of the halachic process. So what's it all about? Now the truth is, the chuppah and the yichud room, they represent the second phase of the marriage process that our sages have instituted, have introduced long, long ago. But the sages, the Chazal, our great rabbis in our history, they decreed that it's not enough for a man to just perform a simple act, just to give the ring in order to be sexually connected with with a woman. Rather, the couple have to act on their commitment to each other. Only once the bride proves that he's serious and actually moves in with that the groom and bride move in with each other, that's when it's considered a marriage. Now, interestingly, in Talmudic times, there was a whole year's interval between the first phase, call it engagement, and the second phase where they actually moved in with each other. So the halachic marriage process back then was that first the groom would give the bride a ring, then the bride would move, she didn't move in with him. She stayed in her house, in her apartment, in her parents' home, wherever she lived. And they spent the year preparing for the big day. And a year later, I guess they thought it through enough, then the couple would move in together and they would complete the marriage process. Today, that's not the way it's halachically done. It's evolved. Today, we do both phases together as one under the chuppah. The first is when the groom gives the bride a ring. He says, Harayat mekudeshet li, with this ring you are hereby sanctified to me, like the laws of Moshe and Israel. And the second phase is when the bride and groom stand under the chuppah together, and then they go into the yichud room in seclusion. So they're being together in this first under the chuppah. And then in the yichud room, that represents their seriousness, their commitment to each other, that it's exclusive. That's the symbolism of the yichud room. If you look at a yichud room, it's always the witnesses inspect that there's no escape door, and that there's nowhere, that it's only them in there, there's nobody else. So this is the way marriages are done today. This is, it's certainly a little bit different than it was long, long ago. So that's just a little bit of the history. And, that's going all the way back. And yes, the Torah has references to marriage, but it's the sages who have given us the specifics, the rules and regulations, how it's done, etc. But I want to go back to just explore the Torah's take on marriage. Okay, how we could use that to perhaps enlighten people today that marriage, to give it a try, to make it work. Just to share with you, there was the period leading up to the Second World War. There were tremendous innovation and sophistication in Talmudic and halachic study. The great yeshivas at that time, you think of it, the yeshivas that existed, the yeshivas that were built at the beginning of the 20th century in Europe, there were systems of study, and there were so many. And you think about the Jewish population, that there were 18 million Jews. I don't think we are 18 million. I don't know the exact number of Jews today. I don't think we've come back to pre-Holocaust numbers yet. It's crazy to think about it. But to also think what we lost in the Holocaust, there was just a tremendous growth of Torah study. And I want to share with you two of the great scholars of that time. One, I spoke about him last week, the Rogatchover Gaon, who was in Russia. He was a great rabbi, or not Russia, Belarus. And he was the one who gave the Rebbe smicha. His specialty was applying abstract theory, okay, and such as ideas from Moreh Nevuchim, from Rambam's Guide for the Perplexed, which touches on philosophical and metaphysical concepts, and how he would apply those ideas to halacha, to Jewish law. In getting to the bottom of the Talmud and halachic authorities' thought systems, he always detected these theoretical patterns that ran through unconnected topics and weaving them together. He was a brilliant scholar, unparalleled. I think he was friends with Einstein at some point, as I once heard. And then there were others. For example, the Brisker Rav, the Reb Chaim Soloveitchik. He was known as Reb Chaim, but he was a brilliant genius. And in fact, when I finished my studies in South Africa here in 2004, I went to study in the Brisker Yeshiva in New York called Yeshiva University. So they both they were contemporaries, and they both had their style of studying. The Brisker way of studying is the most popular way of studying Talmud. Very, very methodical and analytical. That's the way of studying. Anyways, these great giants, these pre-war figures, they tutored. I mean, you think about the yeshivas Chachmei Lublin, one of the great yeshivas that opened at that time, and their student, that was Rabbi Meir Shapiro. And then there were guys like Rabbi Baruch Ber Leibowitz, and there was Reb Shimon Shkop, and just so many other great personalities at that time that they were their students and their contemporaries. Anyways, what did I want to get at? One time, these two rabbis, that's why I was mentioning them, the Rogatchover and Reb Chaim Brisker, they met with each other. And when the Rogatchover saw Reb Chaim, he said, Mazel Tov. This is what are you wishing me Mazel Tov for? Don't know what you're talking about. It wasn't his birthday, it wasn't his anniversary, and he didn't buy a new car, he wasn't wearing a fancy suit. What's this Mazel Tov about? So his friend turns to him, the two rabbis. He says, I'm wishing you Mazel Tov on your wedding. So what are you talking about? I have to remember the story. He said, a marriage is what's called a pu'ula nimsheches. Marriage is a continuous, ongoing process. So I'm wishing you Mazel Tov on your wedding. So Reb Chaim responded to the Rogatchover. He says, if that's the case, then your Mazel Tov is also pu'ula nimsheches. It's also continual from the wedding. You don't have to wish it. You don't have to wish me Mazel Tov again, as you did back then. But the point is, and I want to share with you, what is this concept of pu'ula nimsheches that we could apply to our concept of marriage, and hopefully this could be a lesson that we could teach others and maybe apply in our own relationships too. And I want to share with you something that Reb Chaim explained, Reb Chaim Soloveitchik. He said, in the laws of blessings, you learn the halachas of brachas, and now generally speaking, if you do a mitzvah and you forget to recite a bracha, it's lost. For example, in the times of the temple, you offered sacrifices. If you didn't offer your sacrifice in the time that you meant to, the time expired, it's gone. You can't suddenly remember at your son's wedding that you forgot to make a bracha at his bris when he was 8 days old. And now, I'm going to recite the bracha now. I don't know, say water under the bridge. It's long ago. You can't just make a bracha. If you ate breakfast this morning, you can't make a bracha now for the breakfast you ate this morning. And you certainly can't make a bracha for 30 years ago. Right? Excuse me. But if you remember halfway through our shir now, since I'm keeping you glued to your screen, and you remember that you forgot to make a bracha for studying Torah, right? We're studying Torah here together. Just because you didn't make the bracha yet doesn't mean you can't make a bracha now. So the Talmud discusses, where it's discussed in the Gemara, the difference between mitzvahs that are, so to say, a quick one-time act, and mitzvahs that endure over a period of time. So if you forget to say a bracha on a mitzvah that is quick, it's a one-time act, then you've missed the opportunity. A bris happens once. The mitzvah's done. You can't do anything about it now. But if you forgot to say the bracha on a mitzvah that is pa'ula nimsheches, that stretches over a period of time, as long as you're still in the middle of doing that mitzvah, you could make the bracha. Now, the question is, what type of mitzvah is pa'ula nimsheches? What mitzvah is ongoing? What type of mitzvah? So, it's interesting. Reb Chaim was saying that, logically, that if you forgot to make a bracha at your wedding, you should be able to make that bracha now. No, sorry. If we're going to, it depends how you want to apply the logic. The wedding is a one-time affair. Let's go backwards. If you forgot to make the bracha at your wedding, the wedding happened once. It's a one-time action. The marriage happened under the chuppah. That's it. You missed it. It's done. But he went and he said no. That's not the case. He says a marriage is a work in progress. And therefore, it's not that once you placed the ring on your wife's finger, it's done. It's hers to keep. You're married, and now it's over. So for sure not. He said the marriage, he calls it a pa'ula nimsheches. It's something that keeps going. And therefore, if it keeps going, he says the wedding blessings can be recited even after time has passed, because it's a continuous action. Every day you're working on that relationship. So if it's a continuous action, like certain mitzvahs, as long as the mitzvah's still happening, then it's considered that you're still doing the mitzvah. So in that sense, perhaps you could say, even though you actually had the bris only once in your life, 8 days old, or if it was delayed, as long as a man remains circumcised, it's as if he's still performing the mitzvah of having a bris. So based on that logic, I would think you could do the bracha on a bris. Good, bad example of mine. So according to this logic, this is a concept that could be applied to marriage as well. And maybe that's why the bracha for a wedding, if for whatever reason it wasn't said properly under the chuppah, can still be said based on this logic. I can't tell you the final halacha. I'll have to just look it up in the Gemara. I didn't do that. But the point he's making, I think, at least on a studious level, on an abstract level, is that the marriage is continuous, and therefore you can recite the bracha at any time, because the point is it's something that continues. Not Reb Chaim. That's why he said, the mazel tov you told me back then is also continuous. You don't have to tell me mazel tov every time you see me. Either way, this concept of pa'ula nimsheches, again, whether it's practically applied or not, I can't tell you. It's not. I'm not an expert in the laws of marriage. I would have to check that up. But the reason I mentioned it today is because I think there's a powerful lesson we could take from it. And that is that it's a work in progress. And I think we could apply this to various mitzvahs. For example, back in the times of the temple, if you donated property to the Beis HaMikdash, yes, it's a quick one-time act. Okay, and therefore the person made a declaration. I hereby donate this property to the Holy Temple. But according to this halachic way of seeing things, if it's a pa'ula nimsheches, then for the duration of time it takes for this property to be given to the Beis HaMikdash, you're continuing still to fulfill the mitzvah of donating this property towards the Beis HaMikdash. But what's the distinguishing factor? Why is it that most quick one-time mitzvahs are considered over? You finish doing them, whereas others are considered to be constantly there in the background as some abstract force that's renewing the marriage or donating property to the temple. What makes one mitzvah a pu'ula nimshechas and others not so? So this is something that's discussed, and I wanted to touch on. It's in Chassidus. The idea, let me try to unpack it this way. There's two perspectives. First is fairly simple. Opposites can't merge. White cannot be black. Black cannot be white. It's just the reality, two different colors. The second proposition is that if some power somehow succeeds to merge opposites, that power must constantly force the merger into existence, or it's going to cease to exist. So, let's think, for example, humans and penguins are completely different, right? Genetically, biologically, socially. Clearly, a human cannot be a penguin. And a penguin, as much as I tried to say hello to them at, what's that beach in Cape Town where we find them? Gordon's Beach, Boulder's Beach, whatever beach that is. They don't seem to be human. Now, if extraordinarily, somehow or other, your friend turns into a penguin, you could assume that while the regular rules of the game, this is usually impossible, well, maybe this person is privy to some sort of astonishing power that doesn't play by the usual rules and can make the impossible possible. You already heard it enough times from me that saying impossible means I'm possible and figured it out. But what if one day there would be a fallout with this magical power? What if our penguin friend were to lose his connection with this mysterious force? What happens then? Now he's going to have to play by the same rules as the rest of us. Just regular human, no more penguin. So, what's the point I'm making? That in order for the extraordinary to occur, the engine that powers it has to constantly reinvent the extraordinary results. Otherwise, the ordinary rules return, and the extraordinary is just extra, or just ordinary. So this is a concept that I saw in Chassidus. And it's a beautiful concept, that the world is constantly in a state of creation. It's something we've discussed many times. God is constantly continuing to create and to recreate the world. First, the concept that Chassidus explains is that creation itself is a merger of opposites. Think about it. The physical world was created from a spiritual God. So the spiritual became physical. Physical and spiritual are seemingly opposites. In order for one to become the other, it's a merger of opposites. So if that's the case, God didn't create the world, so to say, by the regular rules of the game. By regular rules, it's impossible for opposites to merge. God created the world by some extraordinary, godly, divine power that is able to achieve the impossible. So if that's the case, then for the world to continue existing, what does Chassidus tell us? It needs that constant force, divine energy, to keep it, to vivify, to animate, to keep the world going. So just as the world is a fusion of opposites, otherwise it would disappear. The thing is, what about us? We also create things, right? My kid thinks he's a computer programmer, creates, I don't know, some kind of software. People are working, building things, even simple stuff. You're an accountant, you create balance sheets. So if you create, just like we're on right now, and all of a sudden they're creating languages. You ever start reading HTML and all that language out there? It's jargon to me. And they're creating software. A contractor is taking bricks, mortar, building a house, and bookkeepers, accountants, taking numbers, crunching numbers, creating balance sheets. When a human creates, they simply take what already exists and changing the form of it. We discussed this very much in our Shabbos course last year. We were only capable of creating something from something, but we can't create something ex nihilo out of nothing. God's the only one who can create from nothing. And that's what God created, our world. From pre-creation nothingness, God created time and space and everything that we've got. A human who creates one thing from another, we're not merging opposites. We're taking two physical things that are creations of God. So two finished products, maybe they're different forms when we're creating food, sugar, salt, ingredients, making something. When God creates from nothing, that's two opposites. So therefore, Hasidus goes on into this whole very concept. We have that divine energy in ourselves as well. God makes us partners in creation, and that's why it's possible for two human beings, a man and a woman, who are very different from each other, to merge two opposites. And this concept, for example, we see in the laws of the temple, where you brought a donation, something that was previously mundane, you made it holy. You brought it to the temple. Same thing we discussed yesterday, the idea that we are able to sanctify and elevate anything we have to make it holy. But that's not the point I wanted to get at, and we have to conclude in a moment. So the idea is that man and woman, in a sense, were opposites, biologically, temperamentally. One's organized, one's this. Okay, I shouldn't make generalizations, but the point is that in order for the two to unite in a marriage of opposites, man, woman, in as much as the marriage is an act that is bringing together these two opposites, you need that extraordinary force. It takes work. It takes work, and that's certainly something that we tell people. You have to give it. You have to put that magic in. And in the Talmud discusses it in great detail, but the point that I'm trying to make is that we explained that it's a pu'ula nimshachas. It's a constant, continuous effort. Remember, success is a journey. So marriage, by definition, yes, it's a paradox. It seems impossible taking two opposites, male and female, so different. But it's a pu'ula nimshachas. It's a continuous work in progress. What I want to conclude with is just some ideas, that some customs that we have that we can apply to relationships, whether for ourselves or others, to hopefully instill healthy, long-lasting relationships. There's an ancient custom that says you spend 40 days praying at the kotel. It's a segula. It's a good luck charm, a good omen to find a shidduch, to find your match in life, your bashert. The saying goes, before getting married, why do you go to the kotel for 40 days? You have to get used to talking to the wall. Jokes aside, the actual rationale is that you have a better chance of changing God's mind in your favor if you keep it at 40 days. You just keep doing it. Whatever the case is, because there's a source for this. When the Jews sinned and we worshiped the golden calf, God wanted to annihilate us. God wanted to destroy us. And God was going to just spare Moshe and his family. Make them his chosen people. But Moshe begged and beseeched, he pleaded with God, and things worked out. Moshe was able to, he went back onto Mount Sinai, and he managed to change God's mind to spare the people. How long was Moshe on Mount Sinai for?
40
How long?
days. 40
He
days.
went up again for the second time. Rosh Chodesh Elul. Came back down with God's message of forgiveness that God pardoned us on Yom Kippur. So 40 days, and that's where this concept of 40 days is, the 40th day, Moshe finally succeeded and convinced God to forgive us. So that's the day of Yom Kippur. So this concept of 40 days of prayer is one that a lot of people do, that they pray at the Kotel 40 days, every day consecutively for 40 days. Why did God change his mind? What did Moshe say on the 40th day that he didn't say on the 20th or on the 32nd or any other day? So the answer, very simple. After 39 days of fruitless attempts at persuading God, at his supplication, begging, pleading, beseeching, you know what Moshe said? Benevolent God, compassionate God. Moshe started using all these adjectives describing God's infinite mercy. And guess what? The strategy worked. Because God acquiesced, God forgave us, even though it was an egregious betrayal, an outrageous act of infidelity. What he couldn't do in 40 days, he accomplished with those two sentences that we say every day in our davening. Right? We say, "Vayavar Hashem apanav vayikra, Hashem, Hashem, kerachum v'chanun," benevolent God who's compassionate and gracious, erech hapayim v'rav chesed v'emes, slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness and truth. Noitzer chesed la'alafim, God who is Noitzer chesed, preserving kindness for thousands. Noisei avayim v'fesha, forgiving of sin, of iniquity, of rebellion. V'nakei, and God could cleanse us. Right? So Moshe beseeched Hashem, and we say these words every day in our prayers, morning at Shacharis and afternoon at Mincha. We say these words in our prayers as well. And of course, in the high holiday season, we're going to sing it numerous times. Hashem, Hashem, kel rachum v'chanun, erech apayim v'rav chesed v'emes. So we say this as well. We use these words for our prayer to Hashem. And before I digress, what would I want to say here? That naturally, Kabbalah, in Jewish mysticism, we learn a lot from the Torah's perspective, the story of Moshe, how he convinced God. Whoops, ladies and gents, I apologize, but my slideshow is over, not because I wanted it to end, but because my computer just turned off. So we'll wrap it up without the slides. My points, I might be mute. No, I'm just saying. I'm just kidding. I just don't have. I won't be able to show you my slides to articulate my points. I wanted to do was to go into each of these 13 divine attributes, but we're not going to do that now because perhaps we could do that as shir closer to Yom Kippur. It will be better to analyze them. Because Kabbalah, the idea I was going to share with you was, and in fact it's quite lengthy, so we probably don't have the time for it anyways now, where we analyze these 13 divine attributes, each of them discussing each of those divine attributes, how we can apply them in our lives. and to our own relationships. So maybe we could do that another day closer to Yom Kippur when we actually want to study these. Why did I want to mention them? Because one of the attributes we say Noitzer Chesed La'alafim, that God is abundantly kind to thousands. Now, I was going to look at, if you saw the last slide that I just put up, was the difference between men and women. Obviously, anyone wants to deny the difference, that there's biological differences, and all the others is delusional. Obviously, at the end of the day, we are different. In Kabbalah, it says men are from this attribute of Notzer, and women are from Nakeh, that God is cleansing. Again, I said I can't go into all the details of it, where it talks about each of these attributes in detail. Okay, so to conclude, there is this idea, when you come to a wedding, you wish the chassan kala. Usually, we don't just say mazel tov. We say mazel tov, mazel tov. What's the double wish of mazel tov? Is because there's two. There's the chassan, there's the kala. They both need mazel to combine in the marriage, to be together all these years on the journey. So, if we come from different places, isn't there a book, Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus? There's a book, I think I once read it many years ago. I think, in fact, I had it in my house. Somebody borrowed it. I don't know where it went. And maybe that's why, if we're from opposites, in the male native planet, what are Mars? Men are from Mars. So we're the Martians. We do things one way. And the Venetians, how do you say Venus? Venusians or Venetians? Anyways, they do it differently. Man is used to doing things the way that are done on Mars, or you want to say in the Kabbalistic source, and there's a different lifestyle from the source of woman. I'm talking about that Kabbalah talks about this. So let's just look at it from this perspective. Yes, there are differences. And marriage is about learning to not just tolerate, but to appreciate. Maybe you want to be a little blind, a little deaf when it comes to certain things. As the joke goes, Gesundheit. The wedding gifts that I'm not just talking about the presents that you unpack and put away, and now all of a sudden you have to get used to each other. I often joke in shul that the best present you can give to the shul is your presence. And I think the best present we could give each other and our family and our children is our presence. And as time progresses, one has to be there. One has to keep the magic. And has to be in each other's presence and keen and interested in each other. But if we're opposites, if one is fire, one is water, if one is black, one is white, if one's from Venus, one's from Mars, how do they merge? And the answer is, of course you can, because the Torah tells us we have the power within us. We are capable of that role because that's the way God created us. So perhaps the idea is that we can't just expect to just marry and hope everything's going to be okay. Maybe it works for roommates. You can get along with each other. You can ignore each other. You get into a taxi. It's fine. You don't have to be best friends with the taxi driver. You just, get to your destination. But that's not marriage. Marriage needs that work. With our spouse, can't just be a status quo. In fact, by status quo, we should be on separate planets. The marriage will only work if we introduce a power that's capable of forcing it into existence. A power that we generate every single day. If we're investing in the relationship. If every day is a wedding day. So it's true, not every day is the wedding day. You can't expect every WhatsApp, every text message, talking about the kids or did you call the plumber or the repairman to be as romantic and exciting as as it was when you first met. But what we can do when the going gets tough and reason says we should go back to the planets that we came from, and to remember the wedding day and to try to channel that energy, that magic, that beauty, that romance, whatever you want to call it, back into the day. Add that extra something, kind word with the morning coffee. Regardless of age and stage, I once heard a story about an old woman who was visiting her husband who was senile, who had Alzheimer's, and every day she would come, and probably this story is true numerous times over every single day, because there are those people who are committed and there are those who aren't. And somebody asks her, he doesn't recognize you. He doesn't know you. He's dementia. He's got Alzheimer's. He will never know. And she said, but I know him. And we're in this together. So we have to be for each other through thick and thin. And of course, as we said, just as the mitzvah act of a wedding, yes, it seems like a once-off, but it's not. It's a pu'ula nimsheches. It's something that continues. I think it's something we could apply to our relationship with God, to our relationship with our loved ones. Giving birth to your children wasn't a once-off affair. It's constant. And the mitzvah of honoring our parents is constant. And all the mitzvahs, we have 74 mitzvahs in our parsha this week. It's more than 10% of the 613 commandments in the Torah. They're all constant. So we have to keep that union going. We have to constantly invest in it. We have to make sure, as we say in our davening, Hashem creates and recreates the world every day. That every day in God's abundant kindness, God is renewing the act of creation. So we have to likewise re-energize that original love, constantly reintroduce the sparks into our relationships. And I think that no doubt, who am I to say this, but this is the idea I wanted to articulate to all of us in every relationship. Keep at it. Make it happen. But unfortunately, sometimes you can't. And for that, we'll discuss tomorrow in tomorrow's shir. Looking forward to see you. Tomorrow we're going to look at the laws of divorce and when you should try to stick it through, when you shouldn't try to stick it through, what about an old age, things like that. I'll try to put together some interesting topics and sources. Looking forward to see you. All the best.